Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's panel. And this discussion is about how the United Nations, and particularly the UN Women and UN Development programs, are advancing LGBTQ inclusion in development. As you all know, this is a very important topic right now, as the whole idea of development is being attacked and rethought in many places. So what we really wanted to do was center this conversation for a few reasons. The first is there is an idea of LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ human rights a lot of the times in the sense of legal protections. And of course, those are super important because those are the ones that provide the necessary framework for the state to protect people. But there's so much more to LGBTQ people thriving, right? There is the idea of LGBTQ people thrive in schools. Can they have a good job? Can they participate in the civic process? And so the United Nations, especially with some other academics, have been thinking about these issues in a very systematic and really incredible way to make sure that policymakers and a lot of our students in the MPAID program, the International Development Program, get a sense that policy to advance the rights of LGBTQ people is just much more than a few set of non-discrimination laws, but rather a more holistic set of policies and advances that particularly the UN has been incredibly forward in developing. So today I'm super excited to have this conversation with three people who do this. And actually I should introduce myself. My name is Diego Garcia Bloom. I'm the director of the Global LGBTQI+ Human Rights Program here at the Carr Center. I'm thrilled to be moderating this today. So we'll start with the UNDP, UN Development Program. We'll start with Jeffrey O'Malley. He's the manager of the UNDP Hub on LGBTI+ key populations, HIV, health, and development. And Jeff will share how the UN global initiatives draw on evidence-based findings to do its work, including some of the incredible stuff they've done with piloting an index. And then Honey Lister, Jiaying, will actually go a little deeper into the Asian-specific context right after. And shortly after, we'll hear from Sophie West-Brown, who is at UN Women doing in the Global League for LGBTQ rights at UN Women. So we'll start with Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Diego. So when, why, and how did the UN system start engaging in LGBTI inclusion issues? And what might happen if the current geopolitical realignments that are taking place right now around all sorts of issues end up undermining UN support for LGBTI rights and inclusion? So as Diego just said, I hope from the panel discussion today, you'll learn about how the UN system's work on queer issues emerged and evolved, how it intersects with broader agendas, including gender equality and sustainable development, and the opportunities and threats that we're facing in the current environment. I'm going to concentrate a lot on the history of this work, how it's emerged. And as Diego just mentioned, Honey and Sophie will get more into details about what's going on right now with specific examples and results. I also hope that in the discussion period, in the chat online and the Q&A, I hope we can together generate some ideas about how to strategize and what to prioritize in UN-related advocacy on LGBTI rights in this moment of really unprecedented uncertainty. So I don't know if any of you online know which part of the UN first took significant action on LGBTI issues. Diego mentioned, the rights framework a moment ago, but it wasn't the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights or the Secretary General or indeed UNDP that started this work. It was the World Health Organization 35 years ago. Most famously on May 17th, 1990, WHO's governing body, the World Health Assembly, approved the removal of homosexuality from the International Classification of Diseases. And many of us around the world now celebrate May 17th as Idahobit, the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, in recognition of that decision on May 17th, 1990. But that's not all that WHO did in 1990. I had joined WHO myself as a young staff person the year before in 1989 within a small team that was called the Global Program on AIDS. And around the same time that the ICD revision was agreed, my boss at the AIDS program, Jonathan Mann, issued a call for every country in the world to decriminalize consensual homosexual activity among adults. Not for human rights reasons, but as a crucial step to reaching gay and bisexual men with HIV prevention and care services. And importantly, Jonathan also emphasized that social inclusion and human rights protections for gay and bi men would lead to improved public health for everyone, not just for LGBTI populations. And this was one of the most significant early milestones in recognizing that public health and human rights are often mutually supportive, as opposed to earlier thinking, which emphasized public health rationales for derogations or limitations on rights. When UNAIDS was created in the mid-1990s, they too echoed these arguments, gradually broadening the scope to pay attention to trans people as well, and then to sexual and gender minorities in general. The most in-depth critique of the association between LGBTI criminalization and public health was published in June 2010 by the UNDP-convened Global Commission on HIV and the Law, which crucially included as commissioners former presidents and prime ministers from Latin America and Africa. And so it very much took this agenda to developing countries. I was the director at the time of UNDP's HIV program when the Global Commission did that report. But then I left UNDP for UNICEF in 2012. And while at UNICEF, I had the opportunity to shepherd through a policy paper on eliminating discrimination against children and parents based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And that was published in November 2014. And although the paper never received significant traction in programming terms at UNICEF, that's a whole other story, it was politically important because, for two reasons. It passed UNICEF's executive board. It wasn't just issued by staff. But then substantively, it also associated the UN system with criticisms of unnecessary and unethical medical interventions on intersex children, which is not an issue the UN had engaged with until that time. Our system engagement on LGBTI issues broadened again in 2018, on health issues broadened again in 2018, when UNDP published a monograph on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and sexual and gender minorities, which of course paid attention to HIV, but also described a much broader range of health issues of importance across the LGBTI spectrum in all its diversity, calling for the first time in a UN document for a much broader approach to health and rights for our communities. So over the past 35 years, there's been considerable mainstreaming of human rights thinking into UN system public health work, not always without controversy or pushback, but we've made pretty dramatic progress. But as Diego mentioned, it's not just about rights, it's not just about health, it's also about development. It didn't take long after 1990 and that first WHO work for other parts of the UN system to get involved and other issues to be raised. So in 1994, the UN Human Rights Commission held that sodomy laws can violate the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And then in 1995, Beverly Ditsay, a lesbian from South Africa, addressed the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. And I expect Sophie will discuss the Beijing conference more in her remarks shortly. By 2000, ECOSOC had issued what's called a general comment on the value of non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Fast forwarding a little bit, in 2008, UNDP became designated as the lead agency on UNAIDS on initially men who have sex with men and trans issues. And that's the first time a designation had been made and an agency had agreed to take this on as a lead actor in the UN. But within 2 years, by 2010, UNDP had broadened beyond MSM and trans populations and HIV to work on LGBTI more broadly and inclusive development more broadly. A few years after that, UNESCO launched an important anti-bullying campaign in schools with a focus on gender non-conforming kids. In 2012, the Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, made the first SG speech on LGBTI rights to the Human Rights Council. In 2013, the Office of the Human Rights Commission launched something called the Free and Equal campaign. But then in 2014-15, I think there was another huge leap forward, a bit like 1990. Within 12 months, several things happened. I mentioned already that UNICEF paper. At the same time, UNDP launched the Being LGBTI in Asia. It was actually the Being LGBT in Asia program. It became the Being LGBTI in Asia Pacific program, and Honey will talk about that in a few minutes. Crucially, the World Bank got involved in LGBTI work that year, publishing the preliminary results of a study in India on the economic costs of homophobia and LGBTI exclusion. Early in 2015, in that same 12-month period, 12 UN entities together issued a joint statement calling for member states to end LGBTI-related violence. And then, perhaps most dramatically, in mid-2015, the Human Rights Council appointed its first independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on SOGIE issues. What else was happening in 2015? It was the beginning of the SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal era. And that included a commitment by member states to leave no one behind. SDGs draw attention to certain populations that are all marginalized or left behind, noting the need for non-discrimination and the importance of inclusion, regardless of a range of things, crucially including other status. And while there's no explicit attention in the SDGs to sexual orientation and gender identity, there's ample room to include them given the attention to sex, to gender, to other status, and to the marginalized. Across the whole agenda of the SDGs, the relevance of LGBTI inclusion is really crystal clear, whether we're talking about health or poverty or education, gender equality, violence, social and political inclusion, access to justice, and so on. Within the UN development system, UNDP was tasked with an overall coordination and integrator role for achieving the SDGs. And as I already mentioned, UNDP published a monograph focusing specifically on the relevance of sexual and gender minorities to the SDG agenda and vice versa. Another hugely important opportunity that emerged for LGBTI people with the SDGs was the agreement of a process for developing common country analyses and SDG cooperation frameworks as joint efforts between the UN system and each country. My own work in the last 5 years has focused a lot on Africa, and we've had significant success in ensuring that the status of LGBTI in exclusion and inclusion receives attention in these SDG-related analyses and plans. And needless to say, that's been the foundation of a great deal of further work, including in countries that still criminalize LGBTI issues, but have explicitly incorporated now attention to LGBTI issues in their development plans. Now, here in Africa, in a diverse group of countries across the continent, more and more countries are explicitly acknowledging violence, discrimination, and exclusion related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Of course, as we should, we hear a lot about Nigeria's prohibition of Same-Sex Marriage Act 10 years ago, Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act last year, Ghana's pending anti-LGBTI legislation. But what most Western observers, I think, aren't aware of is how much progress there's been on LGBTI inclusion in more African countries than the opposite over the last 10 years, especially. 31 countries here still have laws against homosexual conduct, but that's down from 39 countries 10 years ago. 10 countries in Africa now have anti-discrimination laws that embrace at least sexual orientation, some of them gender identity as well. There have been important victories on civil society organizing for queer people, further extension of legal protections for specific populations like trans populations, and a range of other legal and policy victories over the last decade. Of course, there's also a pushback against all of this. And we can discuss that more in the question and answer system. But how have we been pushing back on the pushback? How have we been facilitating as the UN system this progress? First, we've been supporting and expanding the pool of champions in government and state structures, especially senior judges and parliamentarians, but also senior technical officials in key ministries. Second, we've been working with civil society organizations to increase their capacity to engage with the state, to engage with public policy processes, and also to form coalitions with other SDG actors on gender equality, on poverty, on human rights more broadly. LGBT groups alone aren't going to achieve a lot, but in coalition they can. And finally, we've been leveraging the UN's ability to convene actors across government, civil society, private sector, and so on these issues. Now, some of the most exciting work in UNDP the last few years on LGBTI issues has been in the Caribbean, where a general LGBTI inclusion initiative kind of evolved into something focusing on economic inclusion of transgender populations. And that was super important. First, to demonstrate just how marginalized and poor most trans women are, especially. But secondly, to show that you can do something about that. You can work with trans women to bring them out of poverty. Now, tragically, just a few weeks ago, that program was canceled. It was funded by the US government. And fortunately, much of our other work has been funded by other donors and has not yet been canceled. But that has huge implications for the future. So where are we now, just as I finish up? I started by asking, about the role of the UN system more broadly and what we're facing in terms of opportunities and risks. There's one huge opportunity I want to flag now, and I think Sophie might talk about it more. But in June last year, the current UN Secretary General endorsed for the first time a UN strategy on protection from violence and discrimination of LGBTIQ persons. And the strategy is mandatory for all parts of the UN that falls under the UN Secretariat. And other parts of the UN system have been invited to adopt and implement the strategy as well. And most of the most important and relevant UN entities, including UNDP, UN Women, ILO, WHO, UNHCR, and others, have adopted the strategy. It's got two main pillars: integration of LGBTI issues and people into our programming work, and also work internally in our human resource policies to make sure that LGBTI personnel can work effectively and contribute as much as possible as employees in the institution. And as much as we started UN system work on these issues way back in 1990, and we've made steady progress since that time, this new strategy is hugely important because it formalizes commitments and it raises these issues to the level of the UNSG and all the principles of all the endorsing agencies. So it's a huge opportunity moving forward, including as we begin to discuss what agenda is going to follow the SDGs after 2030. But there's also a major crisis, right? The pushback against LGBTI inclusion and rights by certain member states isn't, occurring in isolation. It's been a seismic geopolitical shift. We've really got a new coalition of member states that's strongly against transgender rights in particular, but it's mobilizing against other elements of LGBTI inclusion as well. We've already seen the impact at multiple executive board meetings over the last 7 to 8 weeks, and we're going to see it at CSW, the Committee on the Status of Women that's going on in New York right now, and we'll be seeing it over the years ahead. It's also happening in the context of massive cuts in development assistance in general, especially from the United States, but not only from the United States. And that includes cuts to LGBTI work, but also cuts to HIV work, to anti-poverty work, to work with migrants, all of which is very important for poor, marginalized, migrating LGBTI people with HIV, and so on. So we've seen the consequences of this already in the Caribbean, I just mentioned, and we're seeing it much more broadly. Many of our partners have lost their funding, and the political context is different too. Countries that just a few months ago were nervous about anti-LGBTI policy pushes because of potential consequences internationally may now feel more empowered to move forward with anti-rights initiatives. So I've taken up my 15 minutes, I think. Let me stop there, and we'll hear more about the specifics of UNDP work from Honey and UN Women work from Sophie. And then I, again, really call on all of us to brainstorm together to figure out what to prioritize in this new political environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And then we'll pass it on to Honey.
Thank you so much, Diego. I'm just going to share my screen now. Give me one moment. It's always very difficult to follow Jeff because he has such a wealth of knowledge and is an exceptional pioneer in the space, and programs such as being LGBTI in Asia and the Pacific wouldn't be possible if it weren't for him and the work of his colleagues, as he said, for decades and decades. And so really what I'm going to do today in this portion is give you an overview of the situation in Asia and the Pacific, what UNDP has been doing and hopes to achieve, and really what the circumstances are in this current environment. As Jeff said, we're entering a new space with the limited ODA, etc. And so, yeah, I'm just here to really do a little deep dive and then hopefully answer some questions later on. So what I wanted to start with really is what the situation in the Asian Pacific region is. It's a hugely diverse region. I don't know if many of you are familiar, but it's home to 60% of the world's population. But really, societal stigma and discrimination and legal constraints really do lead to marginalization in all aspects of LGBTI persons' life. I mean, whether it's employment, education, or their civic life. And really, there's really unique regional challenges. I always say this, the differences in people's lives really can vary from border to border. When I go to speak to communities in Thailand or Vietnam or Laos, for instance, they forget that the circumstances just a couple of miles away, a border away, are so different. And so it's really, really diverse region. And of course, as we know, the healthcare needs of the LGBTI community are also very diverse. They face huge healthcare disparities, including limited mental health support and stigma in medical settings. And of course, we've all experienced COVID-19, huge vulnerabilities, as we saw during multi-dimensional crises. And as Jeff touched upon, tremendous legal and societal barriers and various laws across the region, which often lack anti-discrimination protections for LGBTI plus individuals. And so this slide, I just wanted to show a visual of what the current situation is when it comes to same-sex criminalization in the region. The reason I often show this is because I think there's a misconception that the Asian Pacific region is quite an accepting, tolerant region, and there's more tolerance towards LGBTI plus persons. Quite often we at UNDP say tolerance but not acceptance. And as you'll see, there's still significant punitive laws against LGBTI persons in the region, which is why UNDP in the Asia-Pacific region works so tirelessly to protect the rights of LGBTI plus persons. So what have we been doing in the region? As Jeff said, we started UNDP's work in Asia-Pacific on LGBTI plus persons all the way back in 2011. And that's when everyone kind of was conceptualizing what it would look like, what being LGBTI in Asia would look like. And so in 2014, the first phase of being LGBT in Asia began. And so that was really a fact-finding phase. It was all about developing a research base. At the time, if I'm being honest with you, it was hard to get even one government official in the room. So it was really about developing a evidence base for why this work is important and who the communities are that need support. And so through its programs, UNDP has aimed to address inequality, violence, and discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC, and of course promote universal access to health and social services. As Jeff said, we've really been successful in using our convening power to facilitate collaboration between all stakeholders, so government, civil society, private sectors, to advance the social inclusion of the community. And really, this is why we call our programs partnership platforms. It's really about building partnerships and facilitating those conversations. And as I said, these initiatives have generated tremendous amounts of research and data to provide the actual evidence of the social cost of marginalization and to strengthen meaningful inclusion of LGBTI people throughout the region. And so I wanted to perhaps talk a bit about data, if I may, during this, because I know that when speaking to Diego, there was some interest in what the data initiatives are, and also the economic impact of marginalization and discrimination. And so really, why are we collecting data? I mean, data is fundamental to supporting LGBTI plus inclusion. It highlights where the needs are and where the gaps exist, and offers evidence for policy development. However, due to legal and social and technical barriers, data collection and utilization remains limited, underscoring the need for more robust data frameworks. Data really does illuminate unmet needs and the disparities in health, social, and economic areas. And so at UNDP, not just in Asia Pacific, but regionally, we've really been focused on developing that evidence base and supporting evidence-based policy development, which we believe is essential to promoting the equal rights and protections for LGBTI plus individuals. I think Diego said this as well. It's about the holistic lives of the community and not just looking at single protective laws, but also how the holistic implementation of them, right? We support laws the whole way through. So from drafting the laws to lobbying for the laws, and if they are hopefully passed, then looking at implementation. So what does implementation look like on the ground? What does implementation look like in different areas, in rural areas, in urban areas, for different minorities? So whether you're intersectional minorities, whether you're living with a disability, you're a migrant, etc., etc. And so really looking at what that real implementation of protective laws looks like. And really without robust data, policymakers often struggle to address the real needs of LGBTI communities effectively. And I've had a cheeky look at the participants of today's webinar, and I know that there was quite a few advocates, and I know that you've also experienced this, where there's a real need to be able to present policymakers with that data to really identify, to really showcase where the gaps are in protections and services. And so, as I said, we have an inclusive data-driven approach, incredibly participatory in ensuring program relevance and community inclusion. We involve community in every aspect of our work, from developing programs to research, to lobbying, etc., etc. Our role here is to support communities because communities, whether they're at the regional level or at the national grassroots level, they are the ones who are really driving this work. And so over the last, gosh, how long has I've been at the Asia Pacific Hub now for 8 years working on this, but being LGBTI now has been around for, as you can tell, I'm not very good at maths, has been around for 11, 12 years. And in that time, we've supported the development of 24 laws and policies supporting LGBTI persons, including legal gender recognition, anti-discrimination, and civil partnerships. I just wanted to quickly show you, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I just wanted to quickly show you our LGBTI research infrastructure. And I apologize. LGBTI research infrastructure. As I said, we've made sure that we include multi-factor stakeholders throughout our processes of developing that research. LGBTI society, governments, donors, multilaterals, bilaterals. People are quite always shocked that we do in fact engage donors, not just for funding, but in our research, in our data, because they too need to be informed in this process. And of course, academia, research, NGOs. I see some academics today in the participants of this webinar. And so if I may briefly just touch upon the LGBTI Inclusion Index, this is just one rather big initiative that UNDP has been leading in the region now for almost a decade. Professor Lee Badgett was one of the lead researchers of this project. I think many of you are familiar with her work. And in 2017, 2018, around that time, we all convened in Hong Kong. So academia, UN agencies, governments, donors, NHRIs, we all came together to really define what the LGBTI inclusion index would look like. And really, the purpose of this index was to measure inclusion across 5 major dimensions that were decided were of most concern. So that was health, education, safety, civic participation, and economic empowerment. And fortunately, we were able to launch a pilot in 6 selected countries. And so really there were 51 indicators as part of this initiative of the LGBTI Inclusion Index. However, only 22 were chosen for the pilot just due to time constraints and what really was feasible at the time in terms of this pilot of this index. And so the pilot of the index took place in 2022 in the majority of the countries. In my region, it was Vietnam and Pakistan, which were the 2 that were selected. But really, in this time, I want to spotlight Vietnam because really example of how we've then kind of, I always say this, bridge the gap between data and actual development change and policy implementation. As you can see with Vietnam, they scored relatively highly, 0.42. Also, you need to take in consideration what the actual laws are, but it was quite a shock for multiple stakeholders when seeing it, because I think there was a belief that Vietnam had more protection for LGBTI persons. So as I said, it became an exceptionally powerful tool when it came to LGBTI advocacy. And so the preliminary findings from the Inclusion Index revealed significant gaps in data across all sectors, highlighting the importance of ongoing research and advocacy to ensure equal protections under the law. It was a great example of community engagement and collaboration with partners at all levels. I personally went to Vietnam and spoke with the civil society involved in this process, who said it was one of their first opportunities to really be heard by government officials. Everyone was sitting in these focus group discussions, one, to figure out how did they collect the data, and then also to discuss the findings of the data. And really the data-driven analysis led to government guidance on inclusive healthcare practices and HIV prevention, reflecting the need for comprehensive data collection. And some recent developments post this pilot include the Minister of Health's directive to public health practitioners to uphold non-discrimination, emphasizing the shift towards more inclusive health policies, and now a finalized draft, finally, of the gender affirmation law to be submitted in 2025. So really, it's had an incredible impact. And also the government, as well as other bilateral donors, have agreed to fund the second phase of data collection in Vietnam. So it's really been incredible. I just wanted to also spotlight another initiative that we have in Vietnam, which is looking at the economic impact of same-sex marriage in Vietnam. When you look at Asia and the Pacific, due to the different cultural, religious realities, addressing LGBTI issues from a human rights lens or from a health lens doesn't always work. This is the reality of the situation that we're in. And so really sometimes communicating the economic implications really can be a real successful way of reaching certain stakeholders, whether that's the private sector or the government. And so I just wanted to quickly, very briefly show you some of the outcomes of that research, whereby we predicted an increase from 1.65% to 4.36% in GDP per year, should there be legalized same-sex marriage in Vietnam. And the average GDP growth rate in the short and medium term would be 0.17% to 0.44% per year. So as you can see, a significant opportunity for Vietnam. This is something a bit more recent. In 2024, UNDP worked with Open for Business on looking at an looking at the economic case for LGBTQ plus inclusion in Southeast Asia. I've just used the Thailand example, but we conducted the research in multiple countries. I mean, in Thailand, the estimated loss is of 51.8 billion to 121.8 billion baht per annum due to discrimination, which you can see is quite significant. And I think this is a great resource. Unfortunately, I can't go into depth today, but I think it's a fantastic resource for anyone watching today. Philippines as well. I think I've run out of time, but Philippines as well. We've really been impactful in using data to create interventions and create impactful change at the local government level. So what's next for the LGBTI plus index? We actually have secured funding for a 3-year project, and we hope to roll it out in an additional 6 countries. And as I've said, Vietnam themselves have managed to receive funding for the next phase of the index, and we hope to use that data coming out of the index to support and promote more supportive legal and policy change. I've listed a bunch of publications and resources here. Hopefully Diego and Emma will be able to share this presentation with you after, so that you'll have access to those. And really, that's all for now. I look forward to discussing in the Q&A some more information, and also maybe deep dive into the current situation with ODA, and how we really are going to face this, as I call it, crisis. But this isn't the worst crisis we've faced in the region, as we know. So I really look forward to that. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you, Honey. And we'll pass it over to Sophie.
Okay, hi everybody. This is Sophie West Brown. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the Global LGBTIQ plus rights advisor at UN Women. I'm sitting in Bangkok, that's where I'm based, and I have quite dodgy connection at this time of the evening. So if it's okay while I'm presenting, I'm going to just momentarily turn off my camera to see if that helps. Okay, I gather you can see my presentation. So yeah, let me begin. I know we don't have long. What I'm going to do with my presentation is to provide a bit of a broader historic perspective of UN Women's work in this area as it relates to the broader efforts globally in and beyond the UN, and also provide a bit of a strategic perspective rather than going into specific programs in detail today. But I just want to say that I'm certainly available to follow up with anybody and have more in-depth conversations afterwards, because I also need to leave a little bit early and may not be able to stay on for the full Q&A. So yeah, I think Jeff in particular and also Honey were already highlighting the broader efforts in the UN system as a whole and the ways in which we've advanced in terms of policies and programmatically as well in efforts to protect LGBTIQ plus individuals from violence and discrimination over recent decades, as you heard from Jeff, and in particular in the last 10 years. I want to highlight the work that UN Women has done in this area and the important progress that we've made in defining and strengthening understandings of LGBTIQ plus human rights concerns from within our gender equality and women's rights mandate, and really making the case at how this is core to achieving gender equality on the whole and realizing human rights for all women and girls and people more broadly. So I will start there. and explain why that's been important to UN Women, and how this aligns with broader efforts. I first just want to highlight, by way of introducing myself, my role in UN Women was only created a few years ago, in 2020, and the establishment of a dedicated LGBTIQ plus rights position in UN Women is a new thing. It's been really a historic step forward for UN Women, amongst a few other historic steps forward that I will highlight in a moment. And really the intention of creating my role in UN Women has been to indicate the development of UN Women's strategic and conceptual thinking regarding its mandate, regarding human rights discourses, and to ensure that we're more deeply adopting a more intersectional approach to our mandate. So in UN Women, I work across all areas of the organization, straddling across human rights, humanitarian and development streams. I work in policy, programmatic, as well as normative work, and across all of our priority thematic areas, which I'll elaborate on a bit as I go. So first of all, I won't go into depth on this because I know that Jeff has provided the overview of this, and then Honey has given quite specific examples from the region that we're both based in. So I think the key message here is really that there has been a lot of progress. I'm sure you're all broadly familiar with some of that progress, but of course, LGBTIQ plus people continue to face discrimination. And what we find in our work is that there is really no place on earth where LGBTIQ plus people enjoy human rights on an equal basis with the general population or live entirely safely. Stigmatization, discrimination, violence, and exclusion are rife across countries and regions. And we see this manifest in terms of social, political, economic exclusion and rights violations in a number of different areas. And beyond the lack of legal protections that we see in very many countries, there are also, of course, issues in terms of access to employment, healthcare, education, etc., and incredibly high rates of violence, which UN Women is working a lot on. So in particular, I would want to highlight with regards to UN Women's contributions in the UN. So so a lot of our focus is to really sort of draw out the intersecting and multiple forms of discrimination that different groups of people face, and different subgroups within the broad and generic and sometimes quite universal or westernized LGBTIQ plus acronym or label, and we try to in our data analysis work programmatically identify and reach particular subgroups of LGBTIQ plus people, in particular women and gender diverse people, of course, considering the remit of our mandate. And what we find in our work is that LGBTIQ plus women, and that includes, of course, transgender women and anyone that identifies as a woman, face discrimination and exclusion often in much more complex ways, and this is exacerbated at the intersection of other characteristics, including on the basis of race, for example, age, location, ethnicity, etc. And this is often exacerbated in particular contexts, including humanitarian crisis settings, etc. So got a slide here that just sort of it's very top level and just highlighting some of the trends we're seeing in both directions, both advances and setbacks. And of course, there have been, as Jeff highlighted, over the last 3 decades or more, increasing advancements in equality and non-discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC in both normative and programmatic work. And I think it's important to highlight both elements of that, and that in the human rights system, all 9 treaty bodies have made references and recommendations related to SOGIESC. For example, I think Jeff mentioned the appointment of the first independent expert on SOGI in 2016, and how the mandate holders that have followed have continued to develop and contribute to the development of new norms and standards to address violence and discrimination in this area. Honey and Jeff both highlighted the first regional programmatic work, so I won't go over that, as well as the efforts from WHO and the World Health Assembly, in addition to the various legal advancements that we're seeing, which I won't spell out, but of course they span across sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics to quite different degrees, but there is some positive change in all of those areas. And then, of course, the very many limited, the great issue with limited protections across quite a few areas. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go into further depth on that. What I want to move on to now is to look at or to provide an overview of UN Women's framework of commitments in this area, and really highlight the foundational principles that underpin UN Women's positions in this area, as well as its operational approach. So it really, the starting point for us is that gender equality cannot be achieved for all without promoting and protecting the human rights of all people, and that very much includes, and in particular, there are needs to address the human rights concerns of people with diverse SOGIESC. So you can see in the slide, there are 3 sort of pillars that comprise our framework of commitments in this area. On the left, of course, is the fact that, you know, being a rights-based organization, we're guided by the International Human Rights Framework, which does indeed safeguard the human rights of LGBTIQ+ people in many ways. Of course, it's important to note that we don't have an explicitly legally binding instrument, but there are very many important non-binding principles. And so broadly speaking, we would say that the legal obligations are well established under international human rights law. Of course, they're heavily contested, but they do continue to evolve. And again, in the interest of time, I won't unpack that any further, but again, I'm happy to share resources and have discussions bilaterally afterwards around what we mean by that. Also in that area, of course, as Jeff highlighted and Honey really brought to life with her examples, there are the global agendas, and amongst that, I'm referring to the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, the SDGs. Of course, for UN Women in particular, there's the legacy of Beijing. And by that, I'm referring to the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1994. And that was really a watershed moment for gender equality on the whole. And it remains incredibly the most ambitious global blueprint for women's rights that we have. It's important to note that although LGBTIQ+ voices were excluded from formal spaces at Beijing, there was an incredibly historic effort on the part of LGBTQ women, as Jeff briefly highlighted, to carve out their own space through the lesbian tent and other practical efforts in Beijing. And those have continued to serve as a really powerful symbol of self-determination of LGBTQI women, and that we would not be erased from broader gender equality and women's rights agendas. And so that very much underpins the sentiment that we continue to hold in UN Women today. And of course, as Jeff mentioned, we've currently got the Commission on the Status of Women, the 69th session, taking place in New York this week and next week, in which it's the anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And so it's an important space for us to continue to demand a multilateral feminist agenda that is really quite unapologetically intersectional and LGBTIQ plus inclusive. Then I won't go over the SDGs. I think that's been covered, but of course we're very much guided by the principles of leaving no one behind, etc. within that. And then I would also want to highlight other recent developments that provide an important platform for LGBTIQ plus rights work in the UN system. There's our common agenda and the Gender Equality Acceleration Plan that was launched last year. And that particularly, without elaborating, is as part of the broader effort to help us address backlash against gender equality in the UN as well. There is the Pact for the Future, adopted in late last year, and it explicitly references universal sexual and reproductive health and rights, etc. Again, I'm sort of rushing through a bit, but happy to answer questions afterwards. Moving on, there's the UN Secretariat and UN system broader commitments, of which the predominant commitment for us now, as of last year, is the new LGBTIQ plus strategy that very many entities have opted in and committed to implementing, including UN Women. And so I'm leading on that, the implementation of that in UN Women, and as part of that, we're developing an action plan at the moment. And that's to guide us over the next 5 years. And that builds on, and I'm moving to the pillar on the right there, our existing foundational commitments in UN Women, stemming from our strategic plan that explicitly refers to sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as our guidance documents, which are public, and I'm happy to share those afterwards. Let me just quickly move on to explain a bit for those who are not so familiar with UN Women's role more broadly. UN Women is a little unique to some other entities in that it has a triple mandate. And by that, I'm referring to normative coordination and operational arms. And we really see that our intention to and our contribution on LGBTIQ plus inclusion can be reached through each part of our triple mandate. And that's what we're working on at the moment to strategically really strengthen. In addition to that, we're focusing on the key areas that are highlighted on the slide. In the interest of time, I won't elaborate on that either. I would also just add that then at the country and regional level, we have a variety of initiatives in a number of different thematic areas, and very much tailor our approaches to local contexts. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, I won't elaborate on those too much now. Just, to get into acknowledging the present context that we're all operating in, which of course is not easy for anybody, and certainly not for us either. Implementation remains inconsistent, and we face external challenges as well as internal challenges. I've listed broadly some of those on the slide. I would want to highlight as well that we do remain optimistic, and we really see this year as a pivotal year for the pursuit of gender equality, women's rights, and LGBTIQ+ rights within that framework, with the 30 years anniversary of Beijing, as I mentioned, 25 years of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on WPS, as well as the 5-year countdown to the SDGs deadline. So we're really focusing on building momentum around those efforts, but at the same time, really acknowledging that we do face a lot of troubling setbacks. Core principles of gender equality are being questioned. Funding for life-saving interventions are at threat, particularly in crisis and humanitarian settings. These setbacks we're really seeing in very real ways are weakening multilateral commitments to peace, to development, to the SDG agenda itself, and attempting to undermine the UN Charter, as well as the Beijing Platform for Action. So that is what we're up against. But I can assure you that from UN Women's point of view, our resolve remains steadfast, and we're working with the broader UN system to really stand firm on these commitments to all-encompassing gender equality and women's rights, and remain very much resolute and principled in that way, and are receiving, and I know Jeff mentioned executive board meetings and member state engagement more broadly, and I would want to just highlight from our experience that we're receiving a palpable support from very many member states at the moment, who are really reaffirming their commitments in this area. So in the interest of time, I won't elaborate on the deeper integration at the country level, but again, happy to chat to people afterwards. And then here, just on my final slide, again, I won't go over it, but these are just some of the opportunities we see for strengthening action in terms of entry points, and just really very much with the focus on the principle of non-discrimination as the bedrock for pushing forward against the pushback. And I'm happy to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Well, if anybody can stay a little longer, we can take some questions. I just wanted to say, for everyone who has to leave, I wanted to reiterate why we're doing this today. The first is, I think, as a lot of the slides show, there's a big gap between the perception of the lives of LGBTQ people in different countries. Sometimes we anchor to the criminalization law. Sometimes we anchor to other anecdotal evidence. And, the UN is really developing this evidence-based framework that let us really see what the lives of LGBTQ people are like, and actually also gives us a pathway for solutions to that. The second thing, too, is passing a law, as important as it is, and is a critical part of the process, is not enough if it's not implemented and if it's not touching people's lives. And so I just wanted also for all the advocates here to understand that following through in implementation, how that actually touches people on the ground is extremely important. And it's people like the UNDP and UN Women that are really looking into the indexes, into the data that it takes to really get a clear picture of that. And so I hope that you all, as you're thinking about your goals, your activism, and what you're trying to do in your countries, think about some of these frameworks as ways to track the implementation and the actual impact on people's lives. And lastly, I think moving forward too is we're going to have to really see how we can really strengthen these connections between civil society and the UN, because I think there's just so much richness there, and we hope in our program to be able to facilitate more of this engagement later. This was a very big overview, but I think, we've seen so many tools that are unleashed by this kind of analysis, including different ways to talk about this. We can talk about GDP growth, right? How discrimination hurts everybody. And that's a different type of storytelling as well, for people that may not be so open to human rights discourses. And that leads also to activists communicating differently, right? Using the data and the information that the UN is developing. So thank you all. If anyone can stay, we'll we'll ask a few questions. But it was a pleasure to have you all, and thank you for the panelists for your brilliant presentations. Diana asks, in the difficult moment for human rights and LGBTQ rights, which is going to be the role of communications as a tool for education? There's a plan for creating a strategy that aims to educate individuals through storytelling, for example.
Diego, would you like me to answer the question?
Sure.
I would love to. Diana, thank you for your question. I think I think storytelling is an exceptional tool because it really humanizes the struggles of the marginalized and vulnerable communities. It helps to build empathy, understanding. At UNDP, we've been working on storytelling for years now. As I said, when we began this work, we couldn't get allies in the room, we couldn't get governments in the room, private sectors, but really through storytelling, we were able to communicate and provide real-life examples of discrimination and foster allyship. Another thing about storytelling, and I didn't get to discuss this during my presentation, is that you can anonymize storytelling. So you can really protect the community. And I didn't get to talk about safety and security. Safety and security, whether that's digital safety, personal safety, is very important to UNDP, and we've been working since 2017 on protecting LGBTI persons online and offline. And so really storytelling is fantastic because you can, as I said, anonymize. We support civil society with zines. I think that's what a lot of the youth groups use, zines, picture books. Most recently, I was in India with an incredible young advocate who was using storytelling to communicate quite sensitive issues. So the rape and abuse of trans women and young lesbian women and girls in India. So yeah, as I said, I think it's an incredibly strong tool. There are quite a lot of strategies actually online. I just remembered a lot of strategies online for storytelling. I'm going to go find them and share them with you. There's an organization that's actually built an entire toolkit around this. So maybe I'll share with Diego, and Diego can forward it on. But there's an entire toolkit which we've used at UNDP, and I know a lot of people use on creating SOGIESC communications and storytelling. So I'll share that. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you. Jeff, did you want to add something to that?
Very quickly, I think trying to really understand what does and doesn't work in terms of shifting social norms is incredibly important. Political leadership and law reform can be in advance of social norms. I think too often we use social norms as an excuse. My country, Canada, decriminalized at a point when most Canadians were against decriminalization, and the public caught up. But I do think that we have to pay attention to social norms. And the little evidence we have about what really works at scale focuses especially on stories not of queer people, but of people talking about how their own attitudes towards queer people shifted. Women talking about how distressed they were when they found out their daughter was a lesbian, and they kicked their daughter out of the house. But over time, they missed their daughter. They realized their love for their daughter was more important than their religious beliefs about homosexuality, and they came around to embracing their daughter. Stories like that take a listener on a journey through an initial hostile reaction to a place at least of tolerance, if not of acceptance, seem to work better than stories that emphasize rights and bodily autonomy and so on. And that's a message that's hard for activists to sometimes hear. Activists don't want to be tolerated. They want to be treated equally. But my message to activists is, let's use that. Let's really focus on what works and not just what feels good to us.
Thank you, Jeff. And I will say our program, especially our global LGBTQI plus Changemakers network, we're focusing a lot on this idea of storytelling. In fact, for the Changemakers network, we have a master class with Tiernan Brady, who ran the marriage equality campaigns in Ireland and in Australia. A big part of that is storytelling and who your messengers are. We also just did recently a webcast that we have on our YouTube on on how the activists in Hungary beat back a really terrible referendum there, really using the story, like Jeff said, of parents coming to understand their kids. It's a critical tool for this. And then we'll do just one last question. And Graham Robertson asks, with some spaces being unfriendly to LGBTQ people, e.g. UN, CSW, what are some alternative multilateral spaces for governments and civil society to advance LGBTQI plus rights? How do we strengthen those alternative spaces?
Maybe I could kick off on this, but Graham, I don't think any alternative space is truly a multilateral space. I mean, the formal multilateral system has most countries in the world as member states. I mean, it varies a bit from one agency to another. And all of those bodies, general assemblies, executive boards, whatever, they're all divided. And so I rather than saying what's an alternative multilateral space, I think it's really essential we focus on how we work effectively within the formal multilateral spaces. There are, of course, coalitions of countries that can work together, informally and effectively. So in the AU, the African Union, for example, a majority of member states are still hostile to this agenda, but there's a significant and growing minority that are fairly supportive. That's not a formal multilateral structure, but getting South Africa and Angola and Cabo Verde and Cote d'Ivoire and so on to collaborate within spaces like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is very important.
Yeah, I would like to echo what Jeff said about perhaps not looking to alternative multilateral spaces, but looking to what's existing and how we work within those frameworks. I mean, with the UN Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights mechanisms, which I'm happy to share more about after this meeting, it's really important to try and be a part of those coalitions and be strategic in terms of advocacy and advocate for increased participation in those diverse groups. I understand that there is, of course, in this current environment, an unfriendliness, as you said, to LGBTQI plus persons, but with continued advocacy, those barriers can be broken down. And so with UNDP support, of course, UN Women, UN agencies, we're also there to strengthen those existing spaces. But yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. And we will keep talking about this subject more in depth. If you're part of the Changemakers Network, we're going to have a follow-up on this, more specifically on how the UN LGBTI index can be a tool for advocates on the ground to not only make way into conversations with the government, but actually create really strong data and another tool for advocacy. So thank you, everybody, and please keep up. I just shared the link for our newsletter, and looking forward to this community growing over time. Thank you.